Hello and welcome to another episode of The Front Line. I'm Dr. Gary Payenda, and today we have Nikolai Siimes. He's going to be talking to us about an article he just put out on Newsroom that was really, really good. And it's regarding saliva testing of drivers, testing them for drugs, not alcohol. So it's a new and different thing. And we are going to speak to the science behind it, the major problems around it, maybe some of the benefits, if there are some to be had, and hopefully learn a little bit. So without further ado, let's get you on here. Nikolai, uh, hello, and thank you for joining us.
Kia ora. Thanks, Gary. Thanks for having me.
Kia ora. Can you give us a little bit about your very interesting background in like winemaking and being a PhD, I think, candidate? Are you still a candidate or do you have it already?
Yeah, I'm in this sort of final months of a thesis. Um,
Exciting.
so, so getting there. And yeah, I guess a bit of a disclaimer that I'm not necessarily the drug expert and certainly not the sort of roadside safety expert, but a lot of my research has looked at the politics, the cultures, the economies, philosophies of drinking, of drugs, of intoxication. So really interested in, also I come at this as a geographer, so sort of a social scientist, interested in the power structures and the systems of oppression and sort of looking behind some of the rules and policies and figures. Yeah. So thanks for having me.
Nice. Oh, happy to have you. Thanks for coming on. Um, so this is a little bit about your background. Can you just touch on the whole wine making
Yeah. So
angle? It's not every day that I meet someone who makes wine and also studies the role of like intoxication in society and all of that. It's kind of amazing. You're the first person I've ever met that's doing this.
yeah, so that's sort of how I got into this topic. I trained as a winemaker and worked in New Zealand and overseas making wine. And then for my thesis, I was interested in looking a bit more deeply into the sort of wine production economies and processes. And yeah, so that's been the majority of my work for the last few years is looking at wine production. And then this
And
interest
every
developed.
now and then, oh, sorry. I know we've got a bit of a lag, and that's always been a problem. I live a bit rurally. But how did you go from that to this article, Roadside Drug Testing's Puritanical Political Agenda?
Yeah, so I've been working with a few colleagues at the moment on alcohol and how that gets policed and managed in different places. And then more and more the conversation's turning around drugs. So it's like I say, there's been some fantastic work on this by activists and other researchers, but I think it's important to have a sort of a look into the politics and what's really going on behind the scheme. So I can give you a brief sort of overview of what the government's trying to do, maybe, and then look into some of the
Please,
issues.
please. And if you could speak a little bit louder or maybe closer to the mic, I just want to make sure that people can hear you very clearly because this is going to be pretty important. This is being rolled out nationwide at huge expense with a lot of implications for people losing their licenses, getting fined, ending up in jail. And so we really want to speak to every aspect of this. So yeah, please take us through your article.
So the rollout of drug testing is happening right now. The government announced it earlier this month. And that follows a sort of a change to the law in 2022, where they first tried to get these roadside testing kits across the line. So it was the Land Transport Act amendment. And what actually happened is the way they set out the law, there were no devices that were capable of meeting the standards that they set out there. So nothing could actually, the police themselves say that after rigorous testing, it was found that there was no device available to meet the criteria and intent of the legislation. So basically, earlier this year, they changed the laws so that they could have a slightly less effective device potentially. That's something we can talk about. But yeah, so that happened earlier in the year, and now the government's announced that it's being rolled out later this year. So I think it's going to grow over the sort of next 12 months, and they're hoping to do about I think it was about 50,000 tests a year.
Yeah, I did. I ran some of the numbers at, 20 or $40 a test. The international pricing, it might be a bit more in New Zealand, and the machines at, 6,000 to 9,000 a unit, um, maybe a bit more in New Zealand with the exchange rates and everything else. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars that are going to be spent on this program. And I did not know that. I didn't, I knew that there was a problem with the old tests. I think it was the Draeger machines, and they needed to be like at least 80% accurate. And that's a fascinating approach to science and policy. When you don't have the accuracy you want, you don't wait for a better machine. You lower your standards so you'll accept um, a less accurate machine. So it's kind of an interesting way of handling it, and perhaps not ideal. Can you take us through some of how the how the process will work? This is a saliva test, isn't it?
Yeah, it's technically an oral fluid test, which just means saliva and whatever else is in people's mouth. But there's two components. So there's the roadside testing, which is random, so anyone can be pulled over without any reason and tested. And if you, they'll generally do two tests. So if you get a positive on the first test, they'll do a second roadside test, and that's to sort of help with the inaccuracies of the testing. But then they'll also send a sample to a proper lab. So that's the sort of evidentiary um, process. So there will be laboratory testing of an oral sample. But if you return a positive at the roadside, then you're not allowed to drive for 12 hours. And then they issue the infringement notice based on the lab test results.
I always find it interesting when any bureaucracy, whether it's health, which is what I work in, or any other, has no money, no budget to do something. We'll call it exhibit A, but they do have the money to do, exhibit B. And somehow, I guess, I don't know if it's coming out of existing funding or new funding, they will come up with literally tens and tens of millions that this will cost. It's fascinating to me. This sort of thing has been rolled out elsewhere. I think New South Wales and Victoria, if I'm not mistaken, do it. Maybe one or two European countries might do it. But the criticism has always been that it's not ready for prime time because of false positives and false negatives. Those haven't gone away. So can you speak a bit to that? Like, what's the big deal about a false positive or a false negative?
Yeah, I think the fact is that both of those are problems. So you can have sort of an under detection or an under policing and an over detection and over policing. The biggest issue, I guess, with the scheme and the legislation and the tests is it's actually not measuring impairment, it's measuring the presence of a drug. And those two things are not necessarily the same. So we've adopted what's called a per se approach to managing these substances. So they set a limit, a sort of a line in the sand, and if you're above that limit or below that limit, that determines whether you're guilty of drug driving, basically. But the issue with that is that the impairment, yeah, impairment and use are not the same. You can have had cannabis can last in the system much longer beyond the sort of effects of the drug. So if you're a regular user of cannabis, you could potentially have sort of a 72 hours where you're above the threshold. And you're probably not 3 days later impaired, but you could be committing an offence. And it's similar with other
And
drugs.
that might mean a fine, it might be a jail term, it might be, the loss of your job. Let's say you have to drive for a living, or let's say you've got a commercial license. So, my major criticism of these kinds of, half-baked, um, interventions is is that basically it ends up being a way of catching people out who have used cannabis, um, far in excess of any risk they would have had to others. Um, and I think what's interesting for me is that I think this will be a highly effective law, not in saving people's lives on the road, but it will be highly effective at generating unbelievable financial profits and returns for the companies involved, the sort of drug testing companies, the companies that make the kits, which are going to burn through tens of millions a year, millions of dollars worth a year. But also, I think it'll be incredibly effective at at injuring or harming Maori youth who have cannabis in their system, who weren't a risk because it was historical use from 2 days ago, but who will now become unemployable, or lose their job. So to me, that's the clear and present danger with this law. And I'm personally no big fan of drugs, don't use drugs, don't like drugs, and am pretty hard down that line as an emergency doctor. Have seen lots of bad things from drugs, but I do have to tell you that the risk of these drugs, relative to what's being done, is very disproportionate. I think the benefit will be minimal, and as I said, I'm quite worried that it'll affect people's employment far in excess of doing anything good for road safety. Do you have any thoughts or comments on that?
I think that's definitely been the Australian experience. It's been very good at increasing convictions. These schemes are good at getting convictions, but they don't seem to have had. I mean, there's not that long of an evidence period overseas, but they don't seem to have had a huge effect in making the roads safer, or in reducing drug deaths or road deaths. But yeah, like you say, it's going to target certain people, much more than others. The way that the police can sort of pick and choose who they test, I think, can be quite problematic without any reason. And then there's also a medical defense. So, I work at the university. A number of my colleagues have prescriptions for things like THC, which is quite easy to get if you've got money and time and access to those sorts of specialist healthcare.
Mm.
And a lot of people in this country are using drugs like cannabis for similar reasons, but without a prescription. So then they're the ones that can get really slammed. So it's definitely not going to be an even effect on citizens of the country.
And I think the other huge thing that strikes me is that compared to alcohol's effect on killing people and causing accidents and deaths and all of that and expense, the role of these drugs, I'm not going to say trivial, but I'm going to say incredibly minor in comparison to how major and massive alcohol's risks are. So rather than us doing a better job of going after alcohol venues, alcohol sales, drink driving, breath testing, which has a great science base. We know that the higher the concentration, the more risk you are to yourself and others. Unlike with several of these drugs, if what we should be doing is focusing all of these millions of dollars on alcohol, and driving, rather than these other things where the testing is frankly poor, and the possible effect is a shadow of what alcohol is. Um, Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we have seen the rise in drug. Um, I don't want to say related, but about a third of road deaths these days, there's some detection of drugs on the driver. It's hard to say whether that's caused the road death or whether that's just another factor. I guess it's a bit like people dying with cancer rather than dying of cancer. But yeah, about a third. So it is a significant number. Many of those are two drugs or alcohol and a drug. There's a lot of alcohol in cannabis or a lot of
That's right.
cannabis and methamphetamine. But I do agree. If you look at the New Zealand drug harms studies, it's alcohol number one by quite a clear margin, and then meth, um, then synthetic cannabis, tobacco, opioids. Some of the drugs they're testing here are MDMA and cocaine, which are significantly further down the list. And it's the same when we look at the impacts on driving ability. So alcohol is without a doubt a major sort of cause and determinant in deaths, injuries, accidents on the road, and one that's very clearly correlated with dosage. So the more you drink, the worse at driving you are, pretty much without any exceptions. The other drugs, it's a little bit more complicated, and there's mixed evidence. So 100%. But I would say in New Zealand we're getting much better at that drunk driving. I think the culture has changed significantly. The sort of repercussions are there. So in a sense, it does make sense to do something similar with drugs. I'm not necessarily against the idea of the policy. It's just how it's being done.
Interesting. I think it's worth realizing just how much drug use there is in the community. So 15% of people basically have used marijuana in the past. Let's say, was it? I think this number I wrote down here is in the past year, 16%. That's 1 in 6 people out there, but something like 1 in 20 are using on a weekly or more basis. So that's literally hundreds of thousands of people. And there needs to be a clear relationship between this testing and a reduction in harm, which internationally has not been shown, before we start putting money and the weight of the law behind it. It still does seem to me a half-baked idea. And when I read that the advocates for this are saying um, essentially a third of car crashes are sort of wrapped up with drug use, they're not teasing out the alcohol's role in that. Um, it's just fascinating to me that we've taken such an incredibly non-scientific or evidence-based like backing to roll this out. Like, it's so hard for us to roll out things that work. It's quite amazing that this gets rolled out this easily with such essentially weak science behind it. Um, can you, in your article, you hit upon this idea that cannabis, ecstasy, meth, cocaine all actually have different effects on our body and our ability to drive and our risk of getting into an accident. Some of those are pretty counterintuitive and rather interesting. So, can you speak to that for a minute? Because we're going to be testing for this stuff, but we don't even know the significance of some of these things' effect on driving risk.
Yeah, so the benchmark for a lot of this came from an independent expert panel that looked at the potential impairing drugs and their effects and recommended legal limits, and that came in 2021. And yeah, I mean, they found things. I can quote from here: it's impossible to equate the dose of the above drugs with a particular blood alcohol concentration, and then its pharmacological effects. So we can't do that. And other studies have found similar things, weak correlations, mixed evidence. A lot of the time we haven't done the research. But yeah, I do briefly mention in the article that a lot of these are stimulants. So things like meth, MDMA, cocaine are stimulants, which have, in a lot of cases, shown to improve driving, and in others to cause more accidents. So it is a complicated relationship. I mean, stimulate, so they don't, like alcohol dulls your senses, slows your reaction time, slows your motor skills. These kind of do the opposite, but sometimes too much. So they might make people more aggressive, or they might make them take more risks. So that can be a big factor. But a lot of the research shows that it's actually, for example, meth users tend to have more crashes, whether or not they're on meth. So it's got no relationship to how high they are, but the people that take meth tend to get into more crashes. So it's difficult to police that, and I don't think this sort of criminalization approach is necessarily going to help those people. It's not a harm reduction method, and it's quite frustrating to see the government's announce their sort of action plan to combat methamphetamine harm, and that's all about policing. It's all about more police powers, more police resources, which is sort of, I feel like the war on drugs has been tried for so long with very little positive effects. It's been the war on people who do drugs, and the drugs have tended to win the war on drugs. So it's quite frustrating to see a government trying to do more and more of the same. We really need to take a sort of a harm reduction, strengths-based medical support approach. And there was some funding given to sort of mental health and addiction services in the announcement, but yeah, the policing thing doesn't doesn't do what we want it to do.
But I think internationally, you see governments all fall over themselves trying to say that they're all about business. They understand business and money making and profits and commerce. They all are almost trying to outcompete each other to say they have business acumen, and everything gets reduced to a business problem, which means ultimately it's a race to the bottom because everything's getting reduced to a profit problem. And I think what we see with a lot of these sorts of interventions, like wars on drugs, wars are destructive, and when the issue is, let's say, social deprivation or whatever, poverty or any social ill, a war is not really the most effective way to tackle, let's say, poverty, but it's great for raising corporate profits and producing an industry that people, that makes a lot of money for folks. There's this thing I highlighted up on the screen now from your article that was an absolute treasure, and I want to make sure it doesn't just get lost as one random line in your article. It was a base talking about a study on injured drivers in Victoria that looked at basically the odds um, of you getting into trouble when you've had alcohol in your system, methamphetamine in your system, cannabis in your system, and being an injured driver who was found to be at fault. So after the fact, they tested these people and found just amazing stuff. They found that alcohol increased your odds of being at fault and an injured driver at fault by 16, and for really high levels of alcohol, your risk went up about 73 fold or 73 times, with meth having an odds ratio of 19 and cannabis having a small effect with an odds ratio of 1.9. So, literally about 10% or less of the effect of alcohol. And that effect of cannabis was lower than the risk posed by a driver over 60 or under 25. I mean, that just blew my mind. If we want a way of actually prioritizing risk, we're looking at alcohol at like 10 to 20 times the risk of, let's say, cannabis, and the risk of cannabis in the same general level as being over 60 or under 25. Absolutely fascinating. That's a paper I'm going to pull and read a bit more on. What's your comment on that? You obviously had a look at it and thought it worthy of inclusion. Remarkable. It's a remarkable statement.
Yeah, I think a really good study, and similar sort of conditions, but yeah, very clearly showing that alcohol, driving drunk is not a good idea. You're much more likely to cause a crash. They did find that for meth as well, which is interesting, and not all studies have done that. But yeah, like you say, cannabis very low. It's sort of in that noise there, and I think it's also about how people use these drugs, when they use them, where they use them. Um, Also plays in fact into that, but yeah, it doesn't really seem like the biggest road safety priority from that sort of study. And it comes back to the next paragraph actually, which is if you look at the drugs that the government's testing for on the roadside, it's only the illegal drugs. So what we've actually found in New Zealand is there's quite a lot of people driving on sedatives, on opiates. Some of those are legally prescribed. Some of them are legally prescribed and abused. Some of them are bought um, for sort of recreational use. So of the 25 substances on the independent panel, 18 of them are opiates or benzodiazepines or sort of commonly prescribed things, codeine, morphine, lorazepam, that are being found on quite a lot of drivers. So sort of 8% each. It's about 16%. So they're not being tested for, even though we know that those things cause impairment. There's a really interesting. It's clearly not about road safety. It's actually just about policing drugs, and I guess that's sort of the takeaway from my opinion piece there. They're not looking at the things that are the biggest impairments. They're looking at what's illegal and how do we enforce the sort of drug aspect rather than the drug driving.
And as I said, I'm not the world's biggest fan of drugs, full stop. But I am able to call a spade, and I know security theater or political theater when I see it. Like there's there's a lot of like sound and fury, but not much actual saving of lives that is likely to come from all of this effort. And again, I think there's going to be a lot of people for whom this ends up as a legal strike against them, or a financial burden of the fines that will be hard to get out from under. And you just have to ask yourself, like, what is all of this for? Is this um, to fund an industry, create a sort of a new industry, or is it to actually save lives? And of course, they're going to say it's to save lives, but I would like to see really any evidence that it will do this. Um, I know, just as one aside, I'm an emergency doctor, and internationally, emergency doctors were essentially pushed and promoted to use urine toxicology tests, right? There was a time, sort of in my training ages ago, where the push was to test everyone for drugs. And what we learned very quickly was that the tests have all of the liabilities you've been speaking about. They miss a lot of drugs that are super important to know if the patient is on, like tons of them. Like I would almost say the majority of things we were interested in, these tests were not scientifically capable of measuring. And then of course there were the false positives where the person would test positive, but it wasn't real. And that's horrendous for that person's life. It has implications. Um, and so we ditched using them because it was just not ready for prime time. It was not something useful. Now, at the level of like spectroscopy and H high pressure liquid chromatography, the stuff they use in a forensic labs, like a CSI type show setup, those can have great accuracy. And in forensics and autopsies, they can really assess quite accurately for the presence of things. But in the ED, these tests were so poor and still are, and we were testing urine and sometimes serum, blood, not just saliva, that it became a non-issue for us. They're just not clinically useful, and what we go by in almost every case will be clinical indicators of impairment. We do a neurologic exam on a patient. We assess your mentation, your ability to talk and think and be coordinated, and decide if you're intoxicated. We might do an ECG. We might do some other tests, but like the blind testing of quote unquote drugs did not help us even in an ED. So I find it fascinating to think that you'd pop the boot of your car and do this test on the roadside, and that would help you make accurate decisions. Do you want to talk about impairment versus presence? Because I think that's interesting, and also impairment testing.
Yeah, so there is existing tests for impairment. It's the sort of walk in a straight line, balance on one foot. They look at your motor skills. They look at your ability to your speech or your memory, your balance coordination. And often, I think probably the best approach would be to combine that with this sort of a test. But obviously, it takes a lot of time to sort of do that, to pull people out of their cars. But that's a measure of impairment, whether you physically cannot do the things that you need to be able to do to drive safely. Whereas this test does none of that. It just looks at whether there's or has been drugs in a person. And that can, like I said before, it could be up to, several days after consumption of the substance.
Yeah, I wish we would stick with those compulsory impairment tests, the ones of actual how you perform rather than sort of what's in your saliva currently. Some other jurisdictions use testing only after accidents, and that again would be a more smarter, more accurate way of testing people. That once they're compromised by the accident, you then see what's in their let's say their bloodstream. And I think I would have a lot more time for that than this. I just find it a bit indiscriminate and wanton. Um,
We
is
do.
there any? Sorry.
I'll just say that we have done some of that testing in New Zealand. So people that die in a roadside accident, they get a drug test, and then people that fail those sorts of impairment tests get a evidentiary drug test. But what we don't do is often if you test for alcohol at a hospital, for example, they don't then test for drugs. So we don't have the whole picture like they do in Australia. But they do find that some of those people have drugs in their system. But like you say, a huge portion of New Zealanders are using drugs. So the sort of the causal link is missing. So it would be great if we had more extensive testing, for sure.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you think about all the people using drugs illegally added to the number that are using these impairing drugs, these prescription drugs, legally. Like I would love to see that number, but it would be a really significant um, number of folks out there. Uh,
What's your?
yeah,
I'd love to
fascinating.
ask you about the sort of. There's been a medical defence in this legislation. So if someone's been prescribed a drug, even if it's impairing, and they're using it as prescribed, then that's considered fine. But you know, from my perspective, I know there's a lot of legal drugs, the prescription drugs that are either you should avoid alcohol, you should avoid driving, you should avoid operating heavy machinery. I know I've had sedation for wisdom teeth, and I definitely wasn't allowed to drive home. I had to be fetched by someone. They were very sort of strict on that. So, I mean, my feeling is if you're taking a drug, whether it's legal or illegal, and it impairs your driving, then you shouldn't be driving. I don't know, but I'd love to sort of hear from the medical, your experience, what you think on the.
I mean, I can speak to the current system, which is essentially a high trust model, where we leave it to the patient that is on those medicines to do the right thing and to make the right decision. So if I prescribe you a narcotic, like codeine or something else, or tramadol or medicine to help with sleep or anxiety control or an antipsychotic or what have you, that'll go along with some teaching about when and when not to use it. And often it'll be just a baseline recommendation that while your body is adjusting to this, your body, your mind is adjusting to this med, don't drive, don't do child care, don't get into situations where you need to be at the top of your game until you see where it levels out and you know you're functional and how the medicine hits you. But that's just trusting people to do the right thing. And of course, as you said, if they do get into harm, um, we really won't know whether to what extent the medicine that they were prescribed will be the cause of the harm. We are trusting people and we're doing clinical assessments when they come in to see if they appear intoxicated or impaired. Um, and you could argue the risks and benefits of that, but I think the underlying point behind it is introducing a shoddy test doesn't make that situation any safer. Like, introducing testing that is unreliable and not well reproducible with a lot of false positives and negatives that doesn't test for what we would call an endpoint that matters to us, right? A clinically significant endpoint. Um, you're just saying, "Yep, it's in your system," but I don't know, where how do you use that information? And during a time where there's such a paucity of funding for things that really, really do work, uh, you gotta ask, is this the best use of the money that we could come up with in society? Um, yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my experience with prescription medications and driving.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of the adjustment period. I think is what a lot of people have found in the literature as well. It's often the first few weeks of taking a medication where you're at most risk of sort of a driving incident or other sorts of incidents. But yeah, I mean, my understanding is pharmacists and doctors are doing a pretty good job about communicating those risks when they prescribe those medications at the moment. But I do think it's odd that the testing only covers things that are illegal and not just drugs that are impairing. I guess that's the
That is very inconsistent, and it maybe suggests that the goal of this isn't to reduce, like as you alluded to earlier, maybe the goal of this isn't actually to reduce harm or deaths on the roadside, on our roads, but maybe it's just to create sort of an intimidation effect to the testing where people are scared that they will get caught and use it less. That's never been proven to be effective in other modern Western developed democracies. And I don't think that New Zealand will buck the trend and that it will intimidation or using science to intimidate is going to magically become effective. There are more effective things, drug treatment and poverty eradication and a whole host of interventions that you can do that would be more successful, but I'm not sure that that's actually what they were going after with this law. This might just be part of a scared straight. I mean, and there's interesting parallels between this and things just within the courts and prison system of, do you use this to intimidate and scare people, or to punitively or as a prevention? And even if it is either of those things, do either of them actually work? Like, I could understand intimidation or a fear driven agenda for this if you could demonstrate to the world that it was really, really effective and it worked and it made things safer and there were fewer deaths and etc. But like, the world hasn't done that with these sorts of policies. So interesting time, and a fascinating conversation. Do you have any points that you would that we maybe didn't get to, or that you would wrap up with? Anything else you wanted to say?
Well, I definitely agree with you that it's the health and the social responses that are really needed to address drug harm and drug driving and all these issues that we've been talking about. And people like New Zealand Drug Foundation have been advocating for that for a long time. The sort of criminalisation, further enforcement, like you say, it's not an evidence-based, well-supported option for sort of helping the community that's using drugs and helping the broader community that's not. So yeah, it's definitely the sort of the health, social support. But like you say, maybe that's not the politically salient. It's not as sexy. It's not as money making. We don't have a government that wants to do that sort of evidence based harm reduction policy. So yeah, a bit of
I
a
will put
shame.
it out there. I'll put it out there to anyone who's listening who wants to defend the policy and say that it's effective and good and strong and worth doing. I'm happy to spend an entire hour speaking with them or letting them talk about their side of things. Happy to pursue that if anyone is listening and is interested in reaching out to those folks, would be happy to have them on the show to discuss that angle and um, any evidence that they wish to bring to it. Cool.
Likewise, like we've said, it will catch people that are using drugs. It's definitely going to do that, but it's not necessarily going to make the roads or those people any safer.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how this falls out in terms of incarceration rates and fines and money and income. Yeah. So it's amazingly worth talking about, and I thank you, Nikolai, for coming on. Nikolai Siimes, with a great article in Newsroom, and hopefully we'll hear more from you in the future. If you ever want to come on and talk about wine, that might be a very interesting conversation as well. But I appreciate your time talking about drugged driving and the merits and risks of testing for it with me today on the front line. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Gary. Cheers.
All right, just a quick goodbye for viewers now. Send us ideas for stories if you've got them. I obviously find these conversations incredibly enriching and worthwhile. That's why I do it. I do want to say to anyone who's viewing, who might have voted, thank you for making this the Bronze Award-winning current affairs podcast in the nation from the New Zealand Podcast Award. So not something that was really on my radar, not something that I've pushed any viewers to do, but you've gotten out there, voted for this show. So obviously you like something that you're seeing on the show, and long may it continue. Share it with your friends, and hopefully shows like this inform and enrich and maybe move the dialogue on our policies into a more mature, more intelligent frame of reference that probably in regular media, commercial for-profit media, there's just not the time to talk to someone for 41 minutes. But we'll keep doing it as long as you keep viewing and are interested. And yeah, I guess we'll try to go for that gold award next year. All right, see you guys.